Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. So, Tim, you guys in Sacramento have been having a heat wave.
Oh, one of the worst ever. I went to the River Cats game on the 3rd of July, and that's always a fun game to go to, and they have really good fireworks at it. And normally we are the beneficiaries in Sacramento of, even on a very hot day, we have the Delta breeze that comes and cools everything off at night, and there was no Delta breeze. It was as hot at night as it was during the day. So I don't remember a stretch when we've had such uncomfortable temperatures. Now, how about down there? I'm sure it was hot, but hopefully not this hot.
Yeah, well, here in Pasadena, we're in the valley, so it's warms up quite a bit. It's usually upper 80s, low 90s all summer long. So I've gotten used to it, since I've moved here from San Francisco. So that first year I was here, I had a headache almost every day because of the heat. But now I'm good with it. It's fine, and learned to live with it. It looks like Governor Newsom's attempt to thwart the ballot initiative to reform Prop 47 has actually gone cold. So I read his statement where we are unable to meet the ballot deadline to secure necessary amendments to ensure this measure's success. So, Tim, what have you heard? What's the backstory?
As we've discussed before, and if you've read the writings of our Steve Smith, basically Democrats in the legislature didn't want to deal with this issue of retail theft and Prop 47 reform. For them, for whatever reason, it's kind of become a religion to them. They are opposed to changing Prop 47. What was pretty clear, you kind of have to, even if you pass some other laws relating to retail theft. Prop 47 says clearly if you make changes to these code sections, then you have to go to a vote of the people. So the legislature passed a whole bunch of bipartisan bills on the issue, but number one game they played was they tried to put in poison pills, which said if the Prop 47 reform measure that's on the ballot that's being supported by the district attorneys, if that passes, all of these measures would be repealed. And that was about manipulating the ballot, right? So that you would say, well, in the title of summary, which is written by the Attorney General, it would say, this measure repeals 14 bipartisan bills relating to retail theft approved by the legislature. So there is that. So then very late in the process, there is a deadline. In this case, it was June 27th, for the legislature to put measures on the ballot. They, at the very last minute, were negotiating behind closed doors a competing measure from Newsom and legislative Democrats to go up against this measure that has been qualified by the district attorneys. And it's a classic example of, when you have more than one initiative on the ballot, voters often get confused and they respond to confusion on the ballot by voting no on everything. Because ultimately, that's what I believe, despite their public statements. Newsom and many Democrats in the legislature want all these measures to fail. So it was unveiled at the 11th hour, and there were a lot of jeers from this. Keep in mind, the news media pressure on this issue has been second to none. Reporters have been very dogged in their coverage of this issue and asking tough questions of Newsom and the legislative leaders. Voters were kind of seeing through the game here, and so vulnerable Democratic members of the legislature were feeling the heat. So there were not the votes in the legislature to put those poison pill amendments in the retail theft bill, so they had to wave the white flag on that. Well, then, at the 11th hour, even though there had been a tough committee hearing held on the Newsom measure that had passed in the morning in the Public Safety Committee, even though they were prepared to do things like call a special election, which is not uncommon, and put the Newsom measure as Prop 2 at the top of the ballot. So they were doing everything to try to manipulate the ballot, at least in favor of the Newsom measure. Newsom waved the white flag, and he said the statement that you attributed there. Now, I think that statement says two things. Number one, Newsom has been more interested in national campaigning and hanging out in swing states and talking about Joe Biden than actually governing in California. And I think at the end of the day, he just didn't want to get his fingers dirty when his attentions are focused eastward. But number two, I don't know that they had the votes to put the measure on the ballot. It's easier. It only takes 21 votes in the Senate and 41 in the Assembly to put a measure on the ballot. But, given all the heat and that he said we didn't have time to put the amendments we needed to get on there to ensure passage. Despite his pounding his chest that he did have the votes, I'm not so sure that he had the votes. So I think that statement reflected both of those situations. Newsom not interested in getting involved in a Sacramento mess right now, and he probably didn't have the votes to get it on the ballot at the end of the day.
Well, Tim, after all this, as you alluded to, Newsom split town, split Sacramento to help Biden quell these calls for him to step down. So I'm actually amazed that the mainstream media, even the New York Times, is calling for Biden to withdraw. It's a total about face. When for the last couple of years, new conservative media like Fox News and other right-leaning media have called into question Biden's ability to govern. I mean, you see it on TV every night, how confused and lost he is sometimes. But it was all, of course, attributed to right-wing fear-mongering, about Biden's mental state. So now everyone has seen it at the debate. So, Tim, do you think that the mainstream press really believed the White House spin that Biden was in tip-top shape, or are they just embarrassed now that everyone has seen it and are trying to save face? I think more of the latter.
I think it's both, because I think he was shielded from the mainstream press in a lot of instances. And obviously we know, yes, he may have, quote, given press conferences, but he's only calling on friendly people and prearranged questions in a lot of the instances. We hate to get into bias in the media. If a Republican president did this, they would have reacted with the same fury they are today. They're just simply not going to challenge a Biden like they would a Trump. And so now the issue is you have, we can't unsee what we saw, but now you have this battle between, a hot story and the drip, drip, drip of things that have gone unreported for months and years. So those stories are going to continue. Then you have, Biden kind of digging in, and that I think that's part of the age issues is what do we know about our older relatives who aren't, necessarily in the best of health? They can be kind of cranky and cantankerous and dug in. And that's what you're seeing here, that, Joe Biden really believes he's the only person who can win, and he's dug in. Today, he was giving interviews on Morning Joe saying that, well, we had a process and I won. Well, that's true, but nobody seriously ran against him. And the Democrats did everything they could to minimize any competition in the general election. So it is factually correct that, well, he went through a primary and he won all the states. But, if we had a presidential debate like this in the fall of 2023, you would have seen a lot of challengers. So I think what you're seeing is you have a lot of kind of powers that be, Democrats, donors, pundits, political people, Washington people saying, open your eyes. This is a conversation we should have had months ago. If we knew now what we knew then, there would have been major calls for Biden to not run for re-election. And then you have kind of a committed Biden base, and the team Biden that views any of these kind of questions as disloyal. They're starting to push back and push back more forcefully. But the ways they're pushing back, it's not putting the fears to bed that it was a one-time incident. Look at the Stephanopoulos interview. Look at the Morning Joe interview today. He was fumbly. He didn't make a lot of sense in times. It wasn't as bad as the debate, but it's hard to be anything that's as bad as the debate. And then you go to where the American people are at. Trump has gained in the polls since the debate. He's gained in the battleground states since the debate. And, the key question, over 70+% of Americans of all political stripe in virtually every poll taken since the debate says Biden is unfit to serve for president, not healthy enough, too old, whatever the question may be in that vein, to go for another 4 years. Well, if you have numbers like that, that's a key thing. That's a key doubt that you're not going to get out of people's minds. And, yes, we're in kind of a scenario where Biden's only competitive because he's running against Trump. And I would argue Trump is in the position he's in because he's running against Biden. And so, yes, that's true. And that's the binary choice they've been forcing. But, you're just not going to win the general election if over 70% of people believe you're not fit to serve. I think a bigger question that's in my mind and in a lot of people's minds across the partisan divide is, well, is he fit to serve today? And if you doubt he's fit to serve today, is he really going to be fit to serve in 2027? And I think, we all know the answer to that question. That all being said, I do think it's very unlikely that he's going to be dropping out despite all the breathless coverage. It's ultimately up to him. And they've obviously dug in and said, nope, we're it, and there's nothing you can do about it. And, that's giving the people who have to run the campaign fits. And, to now, he hasn't shown any positive step or any proof that, he does have that energy and that passion and that, he just had a bad night.
Well, you're right, Tim. I mean, the Democrats, the Democratic Party, they just don't have any good moves for this. It's kind of like a chess game with you lose in so many directions. If he withdraws, who can they replace him with? Kamala Harris, because she comes with the money, the Biden-Harris ticket. But her polls are terrible, and she could also lose big to Donald Trump. Another candidate might not do much better, according to some polls. And if he stays and resigns later, I can't see him like you. I can't see him serving the full 4 years. Then Kamala Harris gets to be president and will be the de facto head of the Democratic Party. I'm not sure the Democrats want that. So this is all very interesting.
Talking through the mechanics of, okay, if Biden were to agree in the next week or so to step down, well, we're in uncharted waters. What is the process going to be? There's been a lot of chatter that kind of by de facto and for the money, you would have to anoint Harris. I don't agree with that. I would agree with that as you would tear the party apart if you passed over the first Black woman vice president. That there's that issue. But as far as the money will be there for whoever the ticket is. So it's not a money thing per se. You can also refund the donations to the donors and ask them to write a new check to the new ticket. So there's ways around all of that. And certainly the DNC money goes to whoever the candidate is. You can't just anoint who the ticket's going to be. You're going to have a lot of people representing a lot of different constituencies who are going to want to have a say in it, who, you would have a ticket that would be nominated that weren't voted on by people. It'd be voted on by party insiders. There's no ability to redo the primaries, if you will. Would these people even have a debate? And just look at the wide variety of candidates that you have in the Democratic Party, many of whom would be very competitive, strong general election candidates. How would they fare in this kind of party insider world, controlling who the next president would be? So I think it's just, we've not been down this path before, and I think it would be very messy and very complicated to open things up now. But speaking of complicated and messy, as we discussed in in the beginning of our opening here, things have been very messy and sticky in Sacramento these days, with the dragged out negotiations on the budget and the real anger in and out of the legislature on the Prop 47 reform. And we thought, who better to talk to us about kind of what's going on in Sacramento today and some of the issues that are going on, especially as they involve the legislative process and the way business is being done, than to have on our friend Chris Micheli, who's a longtime lobbyist, one of the most respected lobbyists in Sacramento. He also is a professor at McGeorge School of Law, and he has just released the updated version to his book, A Complete Practical Guide to California Government, which you can get online now at your favorite online bookseller. And it's really a how-to guide in Q&A form on anything you've wanted to know about how the process works. And if you want to be a citizen activist or make your voice heard, this is the book for you. So we talk through some of these recent controversies with Chris, and we talk about, some of the ways in which the legislative process maybe is failing us, and some ways where things are pretty good these days. So it couldn't be a timelier discussion of all of these issues that are getting big coverage, but may not be on the front page of the paper despite the growing attention for it, but are really important for our state and our politics and how our government runs.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. And here's Chris Micheli.
Join PRI on Saturday, September 21st at the Four Seasons Hotel Silicon Valley in East Palo Alto for our annual Sir Anthony Fisher Dinner, featuring this year's keynote speaker and Toby Family Freedom Prize recipient, Kimberly Strassel. You read her Potomac Watch column every week in the Wall Street Journal. You see her on TV in her regular appearances on Fox News Channel. And you read her best-selling books like The Biden Malaise. Now, come see her in person at a terrific evening supporting PRI. She'll discuss the 2024 election, what's going on in our nation's capital today, and the fundamental importance of civil liberties. Visit pacificresearch.org/events today to buy your tickets. While you're there, you can learn about sponsorship opportunities. We hope to see you on Saturday, September 21st. Tickets are selling fast, so visit pacificresearch.org/events today to secure your spot.
Chris, it's great to have you on Next Round to talk about your terrific new book. So for our listeners who may not be familiar with your work, tell us a little bit about your background and why you decided to write this book.
Well, thanks for having me on today's show. I started lobbying almost 30 years ago. It's hard to believe it's been that long ago. And about 10 years ago, I started teaching as an adjunct at McGeorge School of Law and really picked up my writing on the legislative process, the legislature itself, the rulemaking process, the lobbying profession, among other topics. And I actually had a couple of colleagues who had suggested that I write a book, perhaps, putting together some of those articles and adding to them. And so my very first book was called Understanding the California Legislative Process. And honestly, I wrote it only because there wasn't anything else out there. And so I thought it would be of benefit to not just students, but even practitioners and those interested in the legislative process. So those were really the things that prompted me to begin writing. And of course, 24 books later, I think I've covered all the potential topics I can.
So the complete practical guide to California government, which you can get at Amazon and any of your favorite booksellers, it's a very user-friendly book that really breaks down for, even I learned a thing or two, even for people who've been around these parts, whether you have or haven't, it really breaks down how state government works. So if you're a listener who's, maybe they're a grassroots activist or they're concerned about something and they want to get involved in state government and making their voices heard, tell us how they'd benefit from reading your book.
Well, I think in order to really participate, I'll say, effectively in state government, either the legislative or regulatory processes, and those two branches of government, of course, the legislative and executive branches, I think first you have to understand the process, how the process works, and where you as an individual constituent, i.e. a voter in the state, or a grassroots organizer, or someone who wants to advocate either for their personal interests or those of a group they may represent. Again, I think you have to understand how it works. And so really that is the purpose of the book, is just helping individuals understand how do the three branches of government actually work. And what I did 6 months ago, I did the first one. It was the first in a series of practical guides, and ended up doing shorter versions on just the legislative process, separate one on the budget process, the lobbying profession, the rulemaking process, and a few things like that. When I went back and looked at the first one, a practical guide to California state government, FAQs, I said, boy, there are a number of topics in all three branches of government that I was covering that I really need to add a lot more. And then I thought, well, I've covered the three branches, but that's not the end of government. There's obviously local and regional governments in the state. And to really understand state government, you also have to appreciate the political and election laws that apply and our Constitution and our statutes. So I ended up, frankly, more than doubling the length of the first practical guide. And I hope it's not too presumptuous of myself to call it the complete guide, because I'm sure that I can never be exhaustive in every topic. But what I meant by complete was, again, not only covering the three branches of state government, but also some other facets. And I conclude the book comparing California government to that of the federal government, of course, upon which we are patterned, not just our three branches of government, but as well our Constitution. And then I tried to put together what I would call one of the most comprehensive glossary of terms. I did a separate, shorter one on for the judicial branch on like legal concepts, rudimentary things, the things that come up in state government, particularly in the legislature, some terms and concepts that people should be aware of. But I had not only developed my own glossary of, like legislative and executive branches terms, but also I then looked over everyone from the Department of Finance that has an exclusive just budget terminology. And I looked at, the Senate and Assembly publications and the Office of Legislative Counsel. And there are other groups, the League of Cities and other organizations that have informational materials about California state government that they've shared with their members. And they've developed their own glossaries of terms. And so I really tried to put together the most comprehensive one so that, every word and phrase that you might hear, in particular the legislative branch, but again, even the executive and judicial branches, that you can look to those glossaries and find whatever it is, a word or term or phrase that you may not know what is the definition or how it's used. Those are all really the component parts of the new book.
So with the media coverage of the state budget debate and the hundreds of bills that are still on docket this year, your new book couldn't be more timely. So thinking about all of the topics you cover in your book, what one process or area of state government do you think is most in need of reform, and why?
Well, I think after, more than 25 years of working in and around the legislative and executive branches of government, and both the legislative and regulatory processes, I've probably got many recommendations for improving both of them. But I think, to me, on the rulemaking side, there are a lot of things that I like about it, including the fact that, for example, the rulemaking agency or department or board or commission actually has to demonstrate that it understood all the comments that it received, either at their public hearing or most often in written comments submitted. And one of the ways that they demonstrate that is that they acknowledge the comment and they say why they're going to accept or reject the comment that has been submitted on the rulemaking. And I think that's a wonderful process. Can you imagine the legislative process is when a legislator decides how he or she is going to vote aye or no on a bill, that they actually have to explain justify why they're voting in favor or against, and whether or not they understood and acknowledged the comments that were made, for example, either in letters submitted or at a legislative hearing. So I think that there are some beneficial things that definitely work. I think that in the regulatory process, my main concern in improving there is the fiscal analyses that are done. The basic one that all regulations are required to receive by the rulemaking entity is, for lack of a better description, almost like check the box. And the legislature for years, particularly in the late 90s and early 2000s, put into the government code, which contains our Administrative Procedure Act, or APA, which guides rulemaking agencies in adopting regulations. They've put in a number of procedural requirements, things like considering the impact of a proposed regulation on businesses, for example, or the workforce, hiring individuals, for example. And candidly, I don't think that they end up doing a really solid job on that. So I'd like to retool some of that analysis and, have them be like hard and fast analyses. If they're going to do them, that they're done properly and really take into consideration these impacts. The other item on the legislative front, I mean, those who I've talked to in the past will know immediately. Number one improvement is reducing the volume of bills. I, candidly think that the legislature is too much of a bill making factory. And so I'd really like to see them reduce the volume of bills that they actually consider. I think that would improve public participation. It would result, hopefully, in more debate and discussion in the policy committees on bills. Today, there are just so many bills that they don't have time to really study them, understand and debate the actual language of the bill being considered. And I think that's really a disservice to both the legislators as well as ultimately the public, because I think that a lot of the language and some of the concepts, really are not studied and appreciated because they just lack the time to do so because they have to get through so many bills.
So let's talk about some of the recent debates where all of the participants involved might learn a thing or two from reading your book. So first, there's been significant media coverage of the controversial Panera Bread deal with the restaurant minimum wage law, where it was revealed that the participants in the legislative negotiations allegedly signed non-disclosure agreements. Yeah. So share a little insight with our listeners. How common a practice is this? And is it something that should be reformed? I mean, you would think that, we should be striving to make the legislative process really as open and transparent as possible.
Yeah. Well, I think I share that perspective. Tim, I'll tell you that when the media raised it with me after it came to light, I said immediately I had never heard of their use in the last 25 years of lobbying. Now, I know a few months after the controversy came to light, former Senator and Assembly Speaker Bob Hertzberg said that he had signed one. I have not heard of any other elected or appointed officials claim that they have. I just don't see, other than perhaps to protect, trade secrets or some sort of, proprietary information or financial data of a particular individual or business. Otherwise, as you know, for the most part, bills are of a general nature, right? They apply to everybody. So take, for example, AB 1228, right, which is the minimum wage increase on April 1 of this year to $20 for fast food workers, and of course establish the Fast Food Council until 2029, et cetera. Why would you even have to know how a minimum wage hike affects a single franchise owner, right? Because the increase applies across the board to all the major franchise operators in the state. And so I figure you can kind of guess that going from $16 to $20 is a 25% increase in the minimum wage, and therefore you can anticipate at least a 25% increase in your labor costs. I mean, why would you even need to know, again, how the whatever fast food restaurant in the local downtown would be individually affected? I don't see why that would be necessary. So I guess from my perspective, a little bit of a long-winded answer, but I don't see why anyone would actually need an NDA in legislative negotiations. Obviously Assemblyman Vince Fong Now, Congressman Vince Vaughn introduced a bill and it was heard and failed passage, and it would have, prohibited lobbyists and elected officials and staff from entering into them. I don't know if, that means that some legislators would like them not to be banned and plan to use them. It's not entirely clear why. I mean, I know that it was raised that it was a last minute gut and amend and some other, kind of procedural concerns were expressed, but I don't know. No one really said at the hearing whether or not they thought that there were legitimate purposes for an NDA or not among the committee members, as I recall. So, we'll see. Maybe in the next legislative session, a new legislator will pick up the bill from Assemblyman Fong and give it a whirl. But in concept, I don't see why they're generally needed. There may be some one-off opportunities where it might be appropriate, but not as a common practice, I would submit.
We'll get back to next round in just a moment, but first, are you getting PRI's regular email updates? If not, go to pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get the facts you need to fight back delivered every week to your inbox. Every week, PRI sends you what you need to know about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento, and gives you the free market ideas needed to save our state and our nation. By going to pacificresearch.org and clicking the sign up button, you can sign up to have Policy Alert, our weekly roundup of all the best ideas from PRI scholars delivered to your inbox. Or you can sign up for event updates so you're the first to know when PRI is coming to your community with great events. So sign up now at pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get PRI's content delivered to your inbox each week.
So your book goes into detail on how the regulatory and rulemaking processes work. We've seen legislators in recent years punt when it comes to the implementation of major legislation to various regulatory bodies. Think the State Water Commission allocating the water bond funds and not funding the sites and temperance flat projects as legislators intended, or the Air Resources Board lending the way to AB 32. So it seems to be a way for legislators to make sure tough decisions are implemented without them being blamed for it. So what are your thoughts on this? Shouldn't legislators be making more of these decisions rather than ceding their power to unelected bureaucrats?
Well, this is one of those, I guess, age-old questions, right? In the sense of, I think, following the lines of the federal government, and the U.S. Congress in particular, i.e. the federal legislative branch, and the state equivalent, the California legislature, has generally viewed the role of executive branch agencies and departments as they're the ones who administer, interpret, enforce the law, particularly by rulemaking, but again, even by how they enforce, a statute that the legislature has enacted. And as a result, they end up developing particular expertise in the particular subject matter and the laws that are under their jurisdiction, right? A Department of Toxic Substances Control, DTSC, or the Department of Insurance, or any other agency or department. By the way, California has over 200 rulemaking entities in the executive branch, starting with agencies and then departments and boards and commissions and bureaus and other such entities, councils, etc. And so I think just like at the federal level, the legislative branch often defers to that expertise, and particularly grants some lawmaking authority, right? We call it legally the delegation of authority. And the legislative branch is allowed to delegate some of its lawmaking authority to the executive branch, which of course creates laws by way of regulation and the rulemaking process. the question, and I am getting to an answer of your question, is really, how much specificity does the underlying statute need to provide or should provide to the rulemaking agency? And to me, this gets into the question of, how much discretion, how much power is to be delegated. I would prefer more to be done in statute, that is by the legislature. There's always going to be potentially some terms or other provisions of a statute that need some regulatory guidance, or perhaps the legislature in statute provides, a maximum or a minimum, for example, of a regulation. And that can be everything from, the DMV, the Department of Motor Vehicles, shall assess a fee not in excess of $100 to administer this license. Well, that obviously says that they can go through a public process and determine, do we need to recoup our costs that are $25 or 50, or, do we have to go up to the 100 to other provisions? And so again, I think that over the course of the last 2 or 3 decades, I think the legislature, frankly, at both the federal and state levels, have authority to the executive branch agencies. And that's not just, by the way, related to those grants of authority by statute. I would also argue that they need to do more by way of oversight and investigation. It doesn't need to create a combative relationship between the two branches of government, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with, and I think the legislature should engage in more oversight of those executive branch agencies and departments, and figure out, hey, how are you applying the law? How are you interpreting it? How are you enforcing it? Is this what we, the legislature, envisioned? And if not, we, the legislature, should make changes to that statute. And so, again, I think to summarize, I think, yes, the legislature has granted too much authority to the executive branch agencies and departments. And I think that the legislature should not only narrow some of those grants of authority, but again, they should also do greater oversight of how those agencies and departments are interpreting and applying the statutes enacted by the legislature.
So more recently, we've had a major controversy that's still kind of ongoing over legislative leaders trying to flex their muscles to get some ballot measures that they don't particularly like off the ballot. Case in point, the one over Prop 47 reform. And I think observers look at this now and they see maybe a type of political hardball that isn't as common these days, but certainly there was a lot of political hardball going on back in the day, certainly in the Willie Brown era. So many would argue these types of tactics further the public's distrust with their government, increases disillusionment. What are your thoughts on this controversy and the kind of tactics we're seeing now? Do you think we'll see lawmakers employing these types of tactics more frequently in the coming years to combat citizens' initiatives that they don't particularly want to see on the ballot?
I mean, this is another area, where there's obviously some controversy going on, and tension, I think, may be the better descriptor, between, the legislative branch, who are obviously elected, 120 of them, to represent the 39 plus million residents of the state of California. And of course, direct democracy. As we know, direct democracy was adopted by the voters in the early 1900s, as championed by then Governor Hiram Johnson. Is it being utilized the way that they envisioned, as more of a check on the legislature? Sure, to some degree. Obviously, the legislature, and I'm not sure it would be any different if another political party were in charge. I think there's going to be that tension and ultimately that battle between The legislature's requirement and obligation and desire to engage in lawmaking, an authority and a duty that it shares with the people. I think elected officials, for good or for bad, have their visions often of where they think the state ought to go. And sometimes it's in line with the general electorate, and sometimes it's not. I mean, obviously, we've had, changes over the decades, over the years at both the federal and state levels, where sometimes the elected officials have to push or lead the electorate to a place that they want to go, or that at least the elected officials want the voters to go, their citizens to go. I don't know that there's any way to do away with that tension. I'm not a huge fan of either side, either outside groups trying to leverage a legislative resolution by way of threatening a ballot measure, or the legislature trying to, undermine or, take measures off the ballot. My first choice, of course, is to have public policy developed through the legislative process. I think it's there for a purpose. I think that we elect these individuals to make laws in the state, good or bad ones, and they should generally be left to do so if on the rare occasion they cannot or will not do something that is vitally important to the citizens, the voters of the state. Then I think it is the electorate's obligation, if not duty, to, take it up by way of, creating a new law through the initiative, or getting rid of one that they disagree with through the referendum process. So again, my first choice is to have the legislature try and solve problems, but I don't think either special interests nor legislators should try to leverage one or the other. At the same time, I also acknowledge that it's a political reality that we face. So
perhaps the biggest change in recent years has not been about process, but related to electoral results, with Democrats taking supermajorities in both houses of the legislature. So we've seen rule changes such as committees are no longer required to actually hold a hearing on every bill and take a vote if the author requests it. This begs the question, how well is the current process serving Californians of all political stripes in a supermajority era? And are the voices of millions of Californians being ignored in Sacramento based on how things operate at the state capitol? Is there anything really different from how it has always been? And should anything be done about it?
If people are unhappy with the results or lack of results coming out of either the executive and or legislative branches of state government, then in my mind, they have, one main recourse, which is to get out and vote. In March, we had about 38 or 39% of registered voters actually cast a vote. And it's an even lower number of those who vote who are of the voting eligible age in this state. If voters are unhappy, the first person that they need to look at is themselves in the mirror, because, 2/3 of them are not necessarily casting their votes and being heard. Look, I'm the first to acknowledge that we don't have but our representative democracy, I think, is far better than that which exists in many places around the globe. The legislature, look, we're not a purple state. California is clearly a blue state. Maybe some would say deep blue state. It's not super duper. The partisan composition of the California state legislature does not represent this, if you will, right? The partisan makeup of registered voters. But that's a part of, the seats that have been put in place by the Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission. So, I'm not sure how to change those seats, but obviously there's a supermajority of legislative seats, which may grow after November 2024, even more so potentially. I don't know if that's necessarily good for democracy in this state. I'm a fan at both the federal and state levels of divided government. I don't think either party in California or in the U.S. should have a monopoly on all, positions. Again, I don't think that that's healthy for democracy. I think that a lot of different viewpoints should be invited and listened to. I think it's the best way to develop public policy, because often I think it's a combination of both parties' input that develops the best policy and the one that is accepted most. One of the problems that we have is the Democrat or Republican, there are often policies at the federal and state levels that are so one-sided that they're rejected or not welcomed by the other party. And the best policies are those where everyone, even their opponents reluctantly, accept and live by those. So whether you like or don't like the Trump tax cuts, or you like or don't like the ACA, so-called Obamacare, both of those were completely partisan measures adopted by the respective parties in power at the time, and clearly do not have the buy-in of the other party. And so, they're frowned upon, they're viewed negatively by their dejectors. And while it's rare that significant public policy is the result of unanimous approval, I think it's helpful for our democracy, again, at both the federal and state levels, to have greater bipartisan acceptance and support of laws and how we address public policy issues, so that they have a greater opportunity to survive long term and to be, ingrained in our society, right? I mean, ever since Obamacare was adopted, Republicans have tried to undermine it, right? Ever since the Trump tax cuts, Democrats have tried to reverse them or increase, higher taxes on wealthy and businesses. It's the same thing. Whichever party is not in power tries to undermine the others. And that's what I don't like to see, again, whether it's at the federal, state, or local levels, because I think those types of actions undermine the institutions and, our democracy. And I think everyone has to respect that, whether you have people disagreeing with federal or state court opinions or other things. There's nothing wrong with that, but don't attack the system or the players within the system, Democrat or Republican. It doesn't matter to me, because when you weaken the institutions of our democracy at the federal or state levels, then it undermines society in general. And ultimately, we are a land of laws. The way we can all pursue, happiness and, productivity and jobs and home ownership and all of that is if we live in a democratic society in which our freedoms are respected and protected. And so if you undermine democracy, you lose that ability to do so. And what makes America great are those freedoms to pursue your personal and professional desires and passions and all that kind of stuff. So that's where I come down on these types of things fundamentally.
We'll get back to our terrific interview in just a moment, but first, PRI's YouTube channel is must watch. By visiting youtube.com/Pacific Research 1, that's the number 1, you can watch webinars, videos, and other original content, including our new Free City Center video tours and interviews. You can watch as PRI's Wayne Weingarten tours Dignity Moves, a San Francisco nonprofit that is reimagining scalable solutions to homelessness with founder and CEO Elizabeth Funk. And you can check out Stephen Greenhut's tour of a proposed new city in rural Solano County that has generated significant interest and intrigue. You can even listen to previous episodes of Next Round Podcast. So visit PRI's YouTube channel today at youtube.com/Pacific Research 1, that's the number 1, and click the subscribe button to receive notifications about our latest content as soon as it's posted. So with the state budget woes continuing, there's been growing talk about reforming the rainy day fund to allow more savings, or tweaking the GAN limit, requiring various tax rebates when state revenue growth reaches a certain point. There's certainly other proposals out there to try to do a split roll for property taxes, or have a wealth tax. And it seems like tax and budget reform, we like to talk about it a lot, certainly on newspaper editorial boards or in academic settings, but usually doesn't go very far. So we've seen many big tax reform efforts crash and burn in recent years. So based on your experience over the years, do you think lawmakers can ever agree on tax or budget reform?
Well, I think to some degree, in terms of budget reform, that's hard to say. I think Republicans, rightly or wrongly, have been cut out of the budget process once the voters adopted Prop 25 in the majority vote, when it was a 2/3 vote. And of course, Republicans were in the minority, but not the so-called super minority. They played a role in it. That's not going to change. We're not going to go back to being one of maybe 3 states that required a 2/3 vote. Rainy day fund, I think, is something that they can and should jointly work on. I know the governor proposed doubling the cap on the Prop 2 rainy day fund in his Jan 10 budget from 10% of the general fund to 20%. I like that. I would assume that Republicans generally would like to see more money placed in reserve. So if you mean reform like that, there's some potential for a bipartisan effort. I think on the tax front, it's sort of hard. It's ingrained in our society at both the federal and state levels that progressivity is needed, at least when it comes to personal income taxes, i.e. the wealthier should pay a higher percentage of taxes than lower income individuals. And so in terms of true tax reform, certainly for budgeting purposes, you want greater stability and probably more of a flat tax notion. But anything which by the way is not crazy on the personal income tax side. That's what we do on the sales tax side. It's a base rate. Property tax is 1% plus, it can grow by a factor. So whether you own a $50 million mansion somewhere or a $200,000 modest home somewhere, you all get assessed at 1% of the value. The corporate tax rate is 8.84. But on the personal income tax side, we obviously have long decided that the wealthiest will pay at the highest rate. And then we have some add-ons like the so-called millionaire's tax for mental health, etc. So trying to bring any true stability to revenues would require a reduction in those super high taxes, which means the wealthiest, the 1%ers, the top 10%ers, would get massive tax cuts, and those on the lower income level would see massive increases. That is not politically feasible either in the legislature nor at the ballot box. So I don't see true tax reform happening, which I think is one of the reasons that led to Prop 2 and the rainy day fund, is they basically said, well, we don't want to change and can't politically change our revenue volatility, because we don't want to change taxing the wealthy. So let's do it on the budgeting side. So when those, capital gains and stock options are exercised and we get a whole lot of personal income tax payments in, let's try setting aside a bunch of that money or using it for like one-time expenditures. So they've tried to, quote unquote, reform the budget side, but I don't see, again, any appetite or viability in changing the tax side for tax reform.
As one of Sacramento's top lobbyists, you've had a front row seat to how state government really operates for decades. So naturally, there's been a lot of change in how business is done, such as a change to a majority vote budget.
Yep.
Thinking of the topics you cover in your book, what state government change of the past few decades do you think has been most beneficial to the average Californian, and which do you think has been the most harmful?
Well, I guess thinking about it from the legislative process and all, I think something that's been beneficial is what the voters adopted in 2016, Prop 54. Which includes not only the ability and the requirement for the public can audio-visual record official legislative proceedings, and the legislature must do so and post on the internet within 24 hours. But the other provision of Prop 54 is the 72-hour in print rule, which may not mean very much at all to the general electorate. But I think the issue and the benefit is that before the legislature can vote on something, the language has to be out on the internet for at least a minimum of 72 hours. And I think that benefits the general population because there's fewer last minute, as we affectionately call them, gut and amends, turning something into a new bill that hadn't existed before, for example, or maybe existed in a different fashion, or worse yet, was defeated somewhere along the line and then gets resurrected. So I think that that's beneficial because it requires public dissemination and at least a minimal opportunity for, affected individuals, affected industries, etc., to have a chance to review it and comment on it. It may not ultimately change the outcome of a vote, but at least having it out there and available is definitely of benefit. In terms of something, bad, well, I think that I won't cite one specific ballot measure. Instead, I'll say I haven't been generally supportive of a number of measures that have either been placed on the ballot or have been adopted by the electorate, whether it's ballot box budgeting or it's public policy done at the ballot box. I really think whether you agree or disagree with the ultimate outcome of legislation, I think having it drafted, for example, by legislative lawyers who have often drafted in specific areas of state law for years, if not decades in some instances, having them draft it instead of an outside interest group or their attorneys who really don't do that on a regular basis like the legislature's lawyers. Whether it's, the inability for the legislative policy committees, and while you may not always agree with the policy that comes out of them, the fact that these individuals have years, sometimes decades of experience in dealing with whether it's, the Judiciary Committee, the Transportation or Housing Committee. I hate the fact that they are cut out of the lawmaking process and don't have the ability to review and analyze and discuss and debate future laws, that instead they get, done at the ballot box. I would much prefer them to at least go through drafting and analysis and even some debate in the legislature before they go to the ballot, And I'm a true believer in direct democracy and don't want to do anything to undermine it. but I also respect the duties and the role that the legislature is supposed to play and should play. And so that to me requires more of a balance. And I think that some of this ballot box budgeting, again, whether it's fiscal or budgetary policy or just general, policy issues in general, from, privacy to whatever else in recent years, that's not the way to do it. It should go through the legislative process that allows greater analysis and review and far more public input. Public input is not just voting on a measure. Public analyzing and debating the language contained in a legislative proposal, and that only occurs in committee hearings in the legislative process. So,
well, Chris, as we close, we call our podcast Next Round because of PRI's proximity to wine country and our love of discussing public policy over a great glass of California wine. So what wine, beer, cocktail, or other beverage are you enjoying these days to celebrate the publication of your terrific new book?
Well, as my wife and kids would let you know, I'm a juiceaholic. Despite a sister who lives in the Napa Valley and has been part of the winemaking industry, I don't partake too often. I'm much more interested in Italian sodas and juices and things like that. So I would probably partake in cranberry, pineapple, those types of fruit drinks. I think, if anything, if I'm sitting out on a beach or by the pool.
Is there a particular maker of one that you like the most and recommend folks try?
No, I don't think offhand. Of course, if I don't make the smoothie or the daiquiri myself, then I guess, somewhere at the store, or, Jamba Juice or something is a favorite stop of mine. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Chris.
Hey, Rowena. Thanks, Timothy.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.